Hey guys, tonight we are slipping softly into the cool dawn of an ancient vineyard. You're barefoot, the dew already soaking into your toes as you wander through rows of twisting vines, heavy with grapes that glow like little purple lanterns. The air is damp and humming with cicadas, and just out of sight a flute trills a half-silly, half-haunting tune. It feels like the beginning of something mythic and strange, because it is. This is the place where Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and the occasional terrible decision, first starts to carve out his legend. And tonight, you'll follow along with him, every stumble, sip, and headache included. You probably won't survive this ancient party lifestyle, but don't worry. I'll keep you tucked under the blanket of history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, post in the comments your location and what time it is for you right now. I always love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The vineyard around you is both real and not real. Half a place, half a dream. Dionysus himself is said to have wandered these fields, a child of contradictions. Laughter on his lips, sorrow in his eyes. Grapes droop above your head, and you can almost hear them whisper as the breeze passes, promising both joy and regret in equal measure. You step closer and pluck one. Its skin taut, bursting sweet on your tongue, and instantly you realize, no wonder this fruit would inspire gods and mortals alike. The mainstream fact here, historians agree vineyards were cultivated in Greece thousands of years ago, around the 3rd millennium BCE. Likely influenced by Mesopotamian and Anatolian practices. Grapes weren't just food, they were potential. They could be preserved, transformed, shared. But here's the quirky tidbit. The Greeks didn't always know what to do with wine once it was discovered. Some early batches were more like sour grape sludge than the silky stuff you imagine. And sometimes they just let jars rot in the sun until the flavor became, let's say, interesting. You'd probably wrinkle your nose at the first vintages, though maybe after a few cups you wouldn't care. Dionysus himself, though, was never only about the drink. He was about the atmosphere. Imagine the smell of fermenting grapes, sharp and slightly yeasty, drifting on the wind. Imagine goat skins hung up for collecting juice, sticky under the fingers. Imagine, most importantly, the gatherings that formed under those vines. Villagers talking too loud, laughing at nothing, forgetting for one evening the grind of fields and wars. That's where the gods' energy hummed, in the joy of a group forgetting itself. Scholars still argue whether Dionysus's myth was imported from Thrace, Asia Minor, or if he was always Greek. Was he a local god of fertility who happened to get a boozy promotion? Or was he a foreigner, a stranger god, arriving with caravans of traders, offering a liquid miracle in exchange for worship? The debates don't matter tonight. What matters is the hush you feel now, walking through vines, as if the ground itself is waiting for your next misstep, your next sip. And yes, as the sky brightens, you hear distant laughter, the unmistakable clink of clay cups, and the beginnings of the very first hangover waiting patiently in the wings. You're not there yet. You'll get to that headache soon enough. But in this moment, you are in the vineyard's hush, where everything feels fresh, promising, and a little too good to be true. Your sandals catch on the roots. You glance back, half expecting to see satyrs already following, goat hooves clattering, wineskins bulging. The vines seem to shift when you look away, curling closer, as if tugging you deeper into this story. The god's presence is heavy here. Maybe he's laughing, or maybe he's yawning from last night's revelry, but either way you are pulled further in, lulled by the sweetness of grapes, by the softness of dawn, by the promise that tonight, and every night after, will end with a story worth retelling, even if it comes with a headache. And so, step after step, you wander with Dionysus into a myth where pleasure and punishment tangle like vines on a trellis, inseparable, impossible to ignore.
You wander further into the vines, and suddenly the air thickens with rumor, whispers of a child who should not have survived but did. Dionysus's story, like his drink, is one part sweet and one part chaos. You're moving now through the tale of his birth, and it's not your average cradle song. You hear voices arguing in the distance, voices of gods, and the smell of smoke and thunder drifts on the breeze. Here's the mainstream fact: Dionysus was the son of Zeus, king of the gods, and Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes. Their love story didn't end in candlelight dinners, it ended in ashes. Hera, Zeus's wife, of course couldn't stand the idea of her thunderbolt-happy husband running around wooing mortals. She tricked Semele into demanding to see Zeus in his full, divine form. When he revealed himself, lightning and glory blazing, Semele didn't stand a chance. Mortals weren't built to look at that kind of power straight on, you definitely wouldn't survive this either. She was consumed, leaving her unborn child in danger. Now here's where the story gets delightfully weird. Zeus, not exactly father of the year, stitched the premature infant into his own thigh to finish growing. Yes, his thigh. Imagine trying to explain that to an ancient midwife. Oh yes, don't worry, the baby will be born through my leg. This was the world's first, and probably last, divine thigh birth. The quirky tidbit. Some traditions claim Zeus carried Dionysus not just in his thigh but also disguised him as a goat or wrapped him in ivy to hide him from Hera's wrath. Apparently, ancient childcare meant turning your newborn into a woodland creature if it kept the peace. Imagine if that trend caught on, nurseries would look like small petting zoos. As you picture this bizarre scene, remember that scholars still argue whether Dionysus's double birth was borrowed from older Near Eastern myths, where gods were often reborn after death. Was it a story meant to show his resilience, or just a wild excuse for why the god of intoxication was never quite like the others? Nobody agrees. But what everyone notices is how his very existence is a loophole, born once, then born again. He's a reminder that things you think are finished can come back in unexpected ways. You can almost hear it now, the cry of an infant echoing out of Zeus's thigh, carried on the wind through these grape rows. It's not the gentle sound of a nursery, it's something stranger, more electric, charged with thunderclouds. And there he is, Dionysus, tiny but destined to be tangled forever with wine, madness, and revelry. The gods probably raised their eyebrows at this unconventional delivery. Maybe Apollo muttered something sarcastic, or Hermes cracked a joke about diapers made of lightning bolts. You imagine the Olympians gathered around Zeus's leg like nosy relatives, peering at the stitches, waiting for the first wail. And when it came, the world was never the same. The vineyard around you shivers, as if remembering that moment. Grapes sway though the air is still. The leaves whisper, 2 births, 2 lives. The god of wine was not supposed to be here, yet here he is, carried on a thundercloud and sewn into the fabric of immortality. You take another step, and it feels like walking deeper into a story that shouldn't make sense but somehow does, like sipping wine that's half bitter, half sweet, and realizing you want another taste anyway. Dionysus's first entrance into the world is as unsteady as the first step of a drunkard, and yet it holds. You watch the sky lighten and think, if this is how the story begins, stitched awkwardly into thunder thighs, what on earth, or Olympus, comes next? You keep walking, and the air shifts from thunderclouds to moss and cool shade. You follow Dionysus out of his thigh-stitched infancy and into a quieter, secret childhood. You can almost hear the drip of water through limestone caves and the soft laughter of nymphs who were tasked with raising him in hiding. After all, Hera was still hunting, and you don't exactly win, most forgiving stepmother, when you're queen of the gods. Here's the mainstream fact: in many versions of the myth, Dionysus was hidden away from Olympus and raised by nymphs of Mount Nysa, a place described as wild, green, and remote. It might have been in Thrace, or Lydia, or India. Scholars still argue over which real-world landscape could have inspired the name Nysa. Each culture tried to claim him, which is fitting for a god whose identity was always a little slippery. Now the quirky tidbit: some myths say Hermes disguised the baby in girl's clothing so Hera wouldn't recognize him. Imagine the god of mischief putting Dionysus in a tiny dress and shrugging like, she'll never suspect. You can almost hear the nymphs giggling at the sight, raising their wine cups in approval of this impromptu costume party. You crouch low with him in the undergrowth, the scent of damp earth and wild thyme filling your nose. The nymphs hum lullabies, their voices twining with the rushing of nearby waterfalls. They feed him honey, figs, and milk, and you watch the boy god grow into a figure both delicate and dangerous. One moment he's stumbling after butterflies, the next, you sense the spark of chaos in his laugh. But here's where the debates kick in: was Dionysus always destined to be this liminal figure, half insider, half outsider, or did his childhood exile create that identity? Historians still argue whether his otherness was a reflection of foreign cult practices grafted onto Greek religion, or if the Greeks themselves always kept him at arm's length. You notice how even now, he seems both part of the party and just outside it, the guest who arrives late but somehow steals the whole show. You reach out to touch the rock wall of a cave, slick and cold under your palm. You imagine little Dionysus darting inside, ivy creeping along the stone like green veins. His companions, satyrs beginning to stir in the shadows, the occasional goat bleating like a warning bell, become his extended family. It feels almost cozy, like you've stumbled into a woodland preschool with fewer juice boxes and more amphorae of fermented grape juice. And the god himself? He grows restless. You can tell by the way he climbs trees barefoot, by the sparkle in his eyes when he watches vines curl tighter around the trunks. He doesn't yet understand what those grapes will mean, but he senses it. He senses that there's something in those berries that will change everything, for him, for mortals, for the way humans experience joy and pain. The forest hushes as you follow him deeper into the shade. You can hear his laughter bouncing between the rocks, soft and strange, like it belongs to someone who has already seen the end of the story. And as you trail behind, you know you're stepping further into a myth that will only get wilder from here. You push past the ivy-draped cave mouth and find yourself in a clearing where the air feels strangely heavier. Dionysus is no longer the hidden child, he's taller now, restless, prowling like someone searching for a spark he can't quite name. The sunlight hits the clusters of wild grapes dangling from a scraggly vine, and suddenly you understand. This is the moment he discovers them, the little berries that will set the world wobbling forever. Here's the mainstream fact: wild grapevines grew naturally in parts of Greece and Asia Minor, often tangled around trees and shrubs. Archaeological evidence suggests humans were already harvesting them long before organized viticulture, but it was the Greeks who tied this fruit so tightly to divine myth. Wine was more than a drink, it became a symbol of culture, ritual, and mystery. And the quirky tidbit? Some traditions say Dionysus didn't just discover grapes, he tasted them in an almost comically curious way, squishing them between his fingers, letting the juice drip down his chin, sticky and purple, before realizing, hey, this might actually be fun. You can picture the god staring at his stained hands, grinning like a kid who's just found candy in the wild. You crouch beside him, the air buzzing with the sharp scent of crushed skins. His eyes light up, and you feel as if he's staring not just at fruit, but at a door that's about to open between worlds. Grapes will mean intoxication, yes, but also release, community, the possibility of forgetting grief for just a little while. You watch him pop one into his mouth, chewing thoughtfully, already scheming how to make more of this magic last. Scholars still argue whether the myth of Dionysus discovering grapes was a poetic explanation for humanity's gradual discovery of fermentation, or whether it symbolized something deeper, the tension between civilization and wilderness. Grapes are both wild and domestic. You can find them clinging to forests, or you can cultivate them in neat rows. Dionysus stands in that exact liminal space, part wild, part tamed, never entirely either. The clearing around you seems to sway, though no breeze moves. Vines creep closer, curling around your ankles like affectionate snakes. You imagine satyrs peering out from the tree lean, already taking mental notes on which grapes will taste best, which ones might ferment faster. You can almost hear one mutter, "We're going to regret this tomorrow," while another nods eagerly, already imagining the party. Dionysus laughs, tossing a handful of grapes into the air, watching them scatter on the ground. You bend to pick one up, its skin taut, bursting under your bite. The juice is tart, slightly bitter, but lingeringly sweet, the kind of taste that makes you want to try again, to see if the next grape will be even better. And in that moment, you realize this is how it all begins. A handful of berries, a sticky grin, and a god who decides the world needs a little more chaos, and a little more joy, even if it comes with a pounding headache the morning after. The first step into intoxication is always smaller than you expect, just a grape between your teeth, just a laugh at nothing in particular, and yet here you are, standing at the edge of something that will ripple through centuries. You step back as the vines shiver again, whispering in voices you can almost understand, pleasure and pain. Joy and regret. Drink, and see where it leads. Dionysus doesn't need to answer. His eyes already sparkle with mischief, and his grin promises this is only the beginning. You follow Dionysus out of the clearing, deeper into a grove where the air grows warm and oddly fizzy, as if the earth itself is brewing something beneath your feet. Amphorae line the edges of a cave mouth, clay jars left to bubble and hiss, each one sounding like it's whispering a secret. This is the first fermentation, the alchemy that turns grape juice into something far more unpredictable. The mainstream fact is simple but world-shaking: fermentation happens when yeast consumes sugar, producing alcohol. Ancient Greeks didn't know the science, they just knew that if you left grapes in a vessel long enough, the juice would shift, thicken, and eventually make you giggle at jokes that weren't funny. Archaeologists have found evidence of wine production in the Near East as far back as 6000 BCE, but for the Greeks, it was Dionysus who made it divine. Now for the quirky tidbit: early wine experiments weren't exactly fine vintages. Some batches turned to vinegar, others bubbled so aggressively they blew the lids off jars, and occasionally the smell alone could clear a room. Imagine being the poor villager asked to take the first sip. Congratulations, you get to find out if this kills us or not. A risky job, but someone had to do it. You crouch beside Dionysus as he peers into a clay jar, foam rising lazily to the surface. He dips his fingers in, tastes the liquid, and tilts his head like a painter judging a new color. His expression shifts, half delight, half scheming, and you know instantly that he's hooked. You hear the soft hum of satyrs behind you, already sharpening their reed pipes, sensing a celebration. Historians still argue whether fermentation was discovered accidentally, say, by leaving fruit in the sun too long, or whether it was a carefully honed practice passed along trade routes. Was it chance, or was it craft? The debate lingers, but in this cave, you feel the mythic version settle like truth. It was Dionysus, restless and curious, who coaxed grapes into something new. The air grows heavier as jars gurgle, like living things. You press your hand to the clay and feel the faint vibration of gases escaping. The smell is sharp, halfway between fruit and something wilder, like the promise of both pleasure and regret bottled together. Dionysus grins, raising the jar to his lips, and as he drinks, the vines outside twitch as though applauding. And you, trailing in his shadow, can't help but sip too. The liquid is rough, uneven, catching in your throat. It doesn't yet have the polish of later centuries, but there's magic in its rawness. The warmth spreads quickly through your chest, and before you know it, you're laughing at the absurdity of clay jars burping like newborns. Dionysus laughs with you, his eyes gleaming, his hair sticky with grape skins. It's here, in this bubbling cave, that the god of wine earns his first true title. Not child, not exile, but inventor. The world outside may still be sober, but in this moment, you are standing at the birthplace of intoxication, a sticky, frothy, ill-smelling miracle that will never leave humanity's side. You stumble out of the cave, a little tipsy yourself from that frothy sip, and find the world brighter than before. The sunlight seems to shimmer, the vines look greener, and voices in the distance carry a new note of excitement. Dionysus has already gathered a few villagers, farmers, shepherds, the curious sort who can't resist free samples. They crowd around, clay cups in hand, eager to try this strange new potion. Here's the mainstream fact: the Greeks often mixed wine with water at gatherings, a custom meant to make the drink stretch further and avoid total chaos. Drinking wine straight was seen as barbaric, the sort of thing only uncivilized foreigners or reckless revelers would do. But moderation? That was the official plan. Of course, you know how quickly official plans collapse once the cups start flowing. And here's the quirky tidbit: some ancient sources claim people tried spiking their wine with seawater, herbs, or even cheese. Yes, cheese. Imagine Dionysus hosting his first tasting and someone proudly dunking a wedge of goat cheese in the cup. Trust me, it enhances the flavor. You can practically see the god raising an eyebrow, equal parts horrified and intrigued. The villagers drink. At first, their laughter is polite, little chuckles at small jokes. Then, as the liquid warms them, the jokes get worse and the laughter louder. One man trips over a vine root and blames the earth itself. Another insists he can sing, though the evidence suggests otherwise. You can smell the tang of wine on their breath, mingling with sweat, dust, and the faint sweetness of crushed grapes underfoot. But the party has a shadow. You watch their faces redden, eyes glaze, and words slur. Dionysus observes carefully, noting both the joy and the unraveling. It's his experiment, after all, and you realize he's not just celebrating, he's studying. Each hiccup, each stumble, each too loud laugh is a data point in his quest to balance ecstasy and endurance. Scholars still argue whether these early village wine trials reflect real rural festivals or are just mythic exaggerations. Were Greek peasants truly this quick to embrace drunkenness, or did the storytellers heighten things for drama? Either way, you see it here in vivid detail, the first awkward, uncoordinated revelries. The sun dips lower, staining the sky pink, and the laughter grows almost frantic. Someone tries to toast Dionysus with a clay cup, misses, and drops it, shattering it into shards. A few villagers clap as if it's part of the entertainment. The god just smiles faintly, as if to say, yes, this is how it always begins. You feel yourself swept into their merriment, warm and a little dizzy. Yet at the edge of the clearing, shadows loom, Hera's anger, tomorrow's headaches, the faint sense that joy always costs something. But for now, no one cares. For now, the village is roaring with laughter, stumbling in circles, inventing excuses they'll need when morning comes. And you, caught in the middle of it all, realize this is the seed of every party humanity will ever throw: too much wine, too much laughter, and just enough chaos to make you forget the dull ache of ordinary life. By the time the moon climbs above the hills, the little gathering has grown into something bigger, louder, and far less organized. Dionysus has officially invented the world's first full-blown revelry, and you're swept right into the swirl of it. Clay cups are passed around so fast you've lost count, satyrs are blowing shrill notes on their reed pipes, and someone is trying to juggle grapes with very little success. Here's the mainstream fact: the Greeks held festivals in honor of Dionysus, many of which were precursors to later dramatic traditions. The dithyramb, a choral hymn sung to Dionysus, eventually evolved into Greek tragedy and comedy. In other words, these messy parties paved the way for theater itself. Imagine your local karaoke night someday inspiring Shakespeare. That's the level of accidental genius you're witnessing here. Now the quirky tidbit: the earliest Dionysian revels often involved participants dressing in animal skins and masks, blurring the line between human and beast. You glance around the clearing and sure enough, a farmer has strapped goat horns to his head with a piece of twine, prancing about like he's auditioning for a play nobody wrote. Another villager wraps himself in ivy, insisting it protects him from drunkenness, which, judging by his swaying, is wishful thinking. The music is clumsy but hypnotic, tambourines rattling, feet stomping in dust. Dionysus dances at the center, graceful yet wild, his hair tangled with leaves. He doesn't direct the chaos, he is the chaos, and everyone else is pulled into his rhythm. You feel it too, your body sways without permission, your laugh bubbles up at nothing in particular, your worries dissolve like mist. But beneath the joy, you sense the tension. Historians still argue whether these first Dionysian festivals were liberating or dangerous. Were they moments of collective healing, or eruptions that threatened social order? You watch as two men nearly fight over a spilled cup, only to end up hugging, weeping, and declaring eternal friendship. The line between harmony and havoc is razor thin. The night air grows thick with smells, sweat, crushed grapes, smoke from a hastily built fire. Someone roasts figs on a stick and forgets them, dropping them into the flames. Another person tries to climb a tree for a better view and promptly falls into a bush, which earns a round of applause. Satyrs whistle and cackle from the sidelines, clearly enjoying the humans fumbling toward their brand of mischief. And Dionysus? He watches with shining eyes, amused but also strangely tender. He knows mortals need this, the release, the foolishness, the reminder that life can be more than plowing fields or fearing the gods. He raises his cup high, wine sloshing, and the crowd cheers as if the gesture alone blesses them. You lean back against a tree, heart thudding with the beat of drums, and realize you're caught inside the very first festival where mortals and divinity blend. It's messy, loud, and undeniably alive. Somewhere far away, Hera is sharpening her wrath, but for now, none of that matters. For now, it's just music, laughter, and the sticky sweetness of grapes clinging to your skin. The fire has burned low, embers glowing like sleepy eyes, and the revelry is fading into silence. You're sprawled among ivy leaves and broken clay cups, your head heavy, your tongue dry as sandpaper. Around you, villagers groan softly, sprawled in awkward angles, one snoring so loudly you suspect he'll wake himself. Welcome to the morning after, the first true hangover in mythic history. Here's the mainstream fact: ancient writers described the aftereffects of overindulgence in wine much as we know them today: parched mouth, aching head, dizziness, and nausea. The Greeks didn't have the word hangover, but they certainly had the experience, and they called it krapel, meaning the fatigue and discomfort following a drinking bout. You can practically feel that krapel clawing at your temples right now. And the quirky tidbit? Some people in antiquity swore that sleeping with a wreath of ivy around your head would ward off headaches from wine. You glance at the villager nearby who passed out wearing a crown of leaves. Judging by his pained groans, the wreath is doing nothing except giving him itchy ears. The camp stirs as dawn breaks. One woman crawls toward the stream, plunging her face straight into the water like she's trying to baptize herself into sobriety. Another clutches a jug of leftover wine, muttering that, a little more, will fix everything, a practice later known as the hair of the dog. Dionysus, of course, is wide awake, looking annoyingly fresh, as if gods are immune to the pounding headaches mortals earn so easily. He watches his followers stumble and moan, and you catch the spark of curiosity in his eyes. He's not cruel about it, more like a scientist fascinated by a puzzle. Scholars still argue whether Dionysus was imagined as a god of both pleasure and suffering, or if his association with hangovers came later, a kind of natural consequence tacked onto his myth. Did he deliberately teach humanity how to recover, or was he just amused by their struggles? The sources don't agree, and your throbbing temples don't care. The smells this morning are not pleasant: sour wine pooled in broken cups, sweat-soaked tunics, smoke from last night's fire clinging to everything. A goat noses its way into the camp, licking spilled wine off the ground, and you can't help but think, poor thing, it's not ready for krapel either. You drag yourself upright, head pounding, and watch Dionysus crouch beside a villager clutching his skull. The god offers a handful of figs, a splash of cool water, and a smile that suggests both sympathy and a hint of "you did this to yourself." He seems to be taking notes, each groan, each cure attempted, another step towards solving the riddle of post-wine misery. And you realize this is the hinge moment. The night gave birth to ecstasy, but the morning births the other side of the coin. If wine is joy, then hangovers are the price tag dangling from the goblet. Dionysus, ever the experimenter, isn't going to ignore this problem. He's going to chase it, poke at it, and maybe, just maybe, invent something to ease it. For now, though, you slump against a tree, eyelids heavy, head throbbing like a drum. The god's laughter is gentle, almost soothing, as he murmurs, "Yes, now the cure must be found." The camp is sluggish, like a beehive after rain, but Dionysus is already on the move. You follow him through the tangle of vines as he gathers mortals groaning and clutching their foreheads. He gestures grandly, as if to say, "Fine. If you can't handle the joy, I'll invent a cure for the pain." What follows is the world's first hangover clinic, equal parts improvisation and theater. Here's the mainstream fact: the Greeks and Romans left behind dozens of hangover remedies, ranging from rehydration with honey water to munching salty snacks. Medical writers like Hippocrates even weighed in, prescribing diluted wine or vinegar concoctions to restore balance to the body. It turns out people have been chasing the cure for as long as they've been chasing the buzz. Now for the quirky tidbit: one ancient recipe involved munching raw onions, another called for cabbage before and after drinking, and yet another insisted you eat fried canary, yes, a bird. You watch Dionysus raise an eyebrow as a villager gnaws an onion like an apple, tears streaming down his face, while another dunks cabbage leaves in leftover wine. The smell alone could cure sobriety, if not the headache. Dionysus orchestrates these experiments with a sort of divine amusement. He doles out honey water in clay bowls, watches mortals slurp it greedily, and nods when they sigh in relief. Then he turns to another group, offering ivy leaves to chew, observing how quickly their grimaces return. You trail after him like an assistant, jotting notes in the air: onions equals disaster, honey equals promising, cabbage equals debatable. Historians still argue whether these cures were medical practices rooted in genuine observation or just cultural rituals meant to give people something to blame when they felt miserable. Was it placebo, or proto-science? The debate lingers, much like the taste of raw onion in the back of your throat. The scene is absurdly human. One man burps loudly after drinking honey water, declares himself miraculously healed, then immediately falls asleep on a pile of grape skins. A woman swears cabbage works, but only if you dance in a circle first. Someone else insists the best cure is simply more wine, which earns groans from the rest of the group. Through it all, Dionysus watches, bemused, as though mortals are children playing dress-up in the theater of pain. He doesn't mock them, instead, he leans in with genuine curiosity. His godhood doesn't spare him from empathy. He likes seeing humans struggle creatively with the mess he's unleashed. The smell of herbs, onion, and sour wine hangs heavy in the air. You sit beside the god as he chews thoughtfully on a fig, muttering that there must be a better way. His followers sprawl around like battlefield casualties of pleasure, and you can almost see him sketching remedies in his mind, weaving together herbs, rituals, and laughter into something resembling medicine. And so, the first chapter of recovery begins: raw onions, cabbage leaves, honey water, and endless trial and error. The headache is still there, pounding, but somewhere in the chaos, a pattern begins to form. Dionysus is onto something, and you suspect this myth won't just be about wild nights, it'll be about mornings, too. By now, Dionysus has a small crowd of groaning volunteers trailing after him, each clutching their stomachs and skulls as if carrying invisible anvils. He seems delighted. Here is a problem worth solving, and he's not going to do it alone. Who better to consult than his ever-loyal companions, the satyrs? Goat-legged, wine-soaked, and always brimming with questionable ideas, they stumble in from the tree lean like self-proclaimed experts on excess. Here's the mainstream fact: satyrs in Greek myth were often depicted as the rowdy followers of Dionysus, embodiments of lust, mischief, and rustic foolishness. They played flutes, chased nymphs, and drank without limit, serving as comic relief in plays and as symbols of the untamed. In short, these are not the guys you want running your emergency room. Now for the quirky tidbit: vase paintings sometimes show satyrs with exaggerated features, tails, ears, and, let's say, oversized attributes, suggesting they were living punchlines as much as companions. You can easily imagine them boasting about cures for hangovers that involve more partying, not less. One satyr here proudly recommends rolling downhill to shake the headache loose. Another suggests dunking your head in goat's milk while singing off-key. The smell of goat fur, sweat, and spilled wine clings to them as they crowd around Dionysus like eager interns. One satyr, balancing on his clumsy hooves, insists the cure is to dance faster than the pain. He demonstrates with wild stomps that make the ground tremble and your own head pound worse. Another pulls out a wineskin and argues that the only cure is to drink until you forget you had a headache. Judging by his hiccups, he's already halfway there. Scholars still argue whether satyrs were originally local fertility spirits absorbed into Dionysian myth or if they were comic inventions of theater later backwritten into his entourage. Either way, they're here, bleeding with laughter, slapping each other's backs, and giving advice that seems designed to worsen rather than cure. Dionysus listens patiently, nodding as though each absurd idea might hold a hidden truth. He doesn't dismiss them outright. After all, these goat-legged companions embody the very chaos he thrives on. You almost suspect he enjoys their nonsense more than the remedies mortals propose. And yet, between the wild suggestions, a seed of inspiration stirs. If hangovers are part of wine's power, then maybe the cure needs to be just as playful, just as strange. The scene is ridiculous. Satyrs juggle amphorae badly, spilling wine down their hairy chests. One tries to balance a wreath of ivy on his horns and calls it the anti-drum remedy. Another insists singing loudly scares away the headache demon, though his tuneless braying only makes your temples throb harder. And through it all, Dionysus chuckles, his laughter rich and soft, like he's both entertained and oddly grateful for their loyalty. You realize this isn't just a search for cures, it's theater. A performance where every stumble, every goatish giggle, every bad idea becomes part of the myth. The Hangover Clinic is a stage, and the satyrs are its comedians, keeping spirits lifted even as heads pound. The fire from last night still smolders, the dawn smells of smoke and sour grapes, and satyrs dance clumsily in circles, chanting nonsense about wine's shadow. You rub your aching temples and admit, grudgingly, that maybe laughter itself is part of the cure. The satyrs have collapsed in a heap of goat hair and giggles, their remedies proving more entertaining than effective. Dionysus, however, isn't done experimenting. He beckons you toward the edge of the grove where the air smells greener, sharper, tinged with herbs. This is where the god decides to turn serious, or as serious as he ever gets. It's time to test plants, roots, and leaves in search of relief. Here's the mainstream fact: ancient Greeks leaned heavily on herbal medicine. Writers like Theophrastus catalogued plants and their properties, and doctors experimented with fennel, mint, and ivy. Some of these herbs were believed to counteract wine's excesses, soothing the stomach or cooling the feverish head. You can almost imagine Dionysus watching mortal healers and thinking, "Fine, I can do better." Now for the quirky tidbit: ivy, his sacred plant, was sometimes worn as a headband during drinking parties because it was thought to cool the head and prevent intoxication. You watch as Dionysus weaves a crown of ivy leaves, placing it jauntily on his head with a grin. He hands another crown to a bleary-eyed villager, who promptly vomits into a bush. So much for sacred science. The grove fills with the scent of crushed herbs. Fennel stalks snap under your fingers, their anise smells sharp and almost medicinal. Mint leaves are rubbed between palms, leaving a cool sting on your skin. Dionysus brews rough mixtures in clay bowls, passing them around like elixirs. Some villagers sip cautiously and sigh with genuine relief, others gag and clutch their throats, insisting the cure is worse than the headache. Historians still argue whether these herbal remedies had measurable effects or if they functioned more as ritual, ways to give suffering mortals a sense of control. Was mint truly soothing, or was it the act of drinking something green and bitter that convinced people they were healing? The line between medicine and magic blurs here, just as it always did in Dionysus's orbit. You kneel beside a villager chewing mint, his eyes watering, while another presses fennel stalks to her temples as if they're cooling rods. The god hovers nearby, scribbling mental notes with a smile. He seems pleased not only by the successes but by the failures, the way mortals stubbornly keep trying, even when the results are laughably awful. The air hums with strange music, the rustle of leaves, the faint snore of a satyr, the bubbling of an herbal brew gone wrong. One concoction foams over, fizzing like a cauldron, staining the ground a suspicious green. Another turns out surprisingly pleasant, tasting of honey and mint, and suddenly half the camp is clamoring for it. You sip cautiously. The mint cools your tongue, the honey soothes your throat, and for a fleeting moment, your headache dulls. Then a satyr burps nearby, and the pounding rushes back. Still, you can't help smiling. Dionysus watches your reaction closely, his expression a mixture of pride and mischief, like a chef unveiling a recipe that's 60% genius and 40% prank. And so the experiments continue, ivy crowns, fennel stalks, mint brews, each one part cure, part performance. You realize that the god isn't just inventing remedies, he's inventing the ritual of recovery, turning even misery into a story worth retelling. The grove quiets as the sun climbs higher, and Dionysus gestures for everyone to gather around a low stone table. You sit cross-legged with the rest, your temples still pulsing, but the smell of food drifts in, promising comfort. Dionysus, ever the experimenter, has realized that herbs alone aren't enough. Maybe, just maybe, hangovers can be tamed by what you eat alongside the wine. Thus begins the first lesson in food pairings. Here's the mainstream fact: the Greeks often ate olives, cheese, and bread during drinking sessions. These salty, fatty foods slowed absorption and gave revelers something to soak up the excess. Symposia weren't just about wine, they were about conversation and little dishes of snacks known as tragimata. Wine without food was considered uncivilized. Now the quirky tidbit: one ancient writer swore that fried sheep lungs were the ultimate drinking companion. Another suggested dried tuna flakes. You watch a satyr toss sheep offal onto hot stones with great enthusiasm while mortals eye the sizzling mess with less confidence. The smell is halfway between comforting and alarming. The table becomes a laboratory of flavors. Dionysus breaks bread and dips it into wine, humming thoughtfully. He hands you a piece of salty cheese, crumbly and sharp, and instructs you to chew slowly. The salt stings your tongue, but then, strangely, your headache lessens, the salt and fat grounding you back into your body. You glance around and see others perking up too, their groans fading as they nibble olives and figs. Scholars still argue whether these food rituals were born from medical wisdom or simply common sense. Did Greeks deliberately engineer wine-friendly diets, or did they just notice that cheese tasted better with a cup in hand? Either way, Dionysus seems delighted with the experiment. He claps his hands, declaring food the faithful companion of wine, partners in crime and in cure. The smells around you are intoxicating in their own way: charred meat, briny olives, honey dripping from figs. Satyrs tear into bread loaves, their faces smeared with cheese, while mortals find themselves laughing again, soothed by the return of appetite. Even your head feels lighter, the pounding dulled by the rhythm of chewing. Dionysus himself is radiant in this moment, wine in one hand, a fig in the other. He balances indulgence and remedy with the ease of a magician pulling coins from the air. Watching him, you realize the god isn't simply teaching cures, he's teaching balance, layering joy with caution, feasting with restraint. And yet, restraint is not the whole picture. The satyrs quickly prove that bread and olives can only delay, not erase, chaos. One tries to stuff an entire wheel of cheese into his mouth, another dips figs straight into a wine jar, splashing juice across the table. Dionysus throws back his head and laughs, a sound that makes the vineyard shiver with delight. You take another bite of bread, sip a little diluted wine, and feel the lesson settle. Every drink should have its counterweight, every excess its anchor. With food, the edge dulls, the night lasts longer, and the morning, just maybe, hurts a little less. The meal winds down, crumbs of bread scattered, olive pits tossed into the grass. But Dionysus is restless again. He beckons you toward the shore, where the salty air mixes with the last traces of wine. A ship waits, broad, wooden, creaking at anchor, and you realize the god isn't content with one village or one grove. His invention, this strange mixture of pleasure and pain, is meant to travel. Tonight, you're sailing with him as wine spills into the wider world. Here's the mainstream fact: the Greeks spread viticulture across the Mediterranean, planting vineyards wherever they settled, from the islands of the Aegean to the coasts of Italy and beyond. Amphorae filled with wine became staples of trade, stamped with city emblems so merchants knew exactly where the vintage came from. The sea carried not just goods, but culture, ideas, and rituals. Now for the quirky tidbit: some amphorae had pointed bottoms so they could be wedged upright into sand or mud at the docks. Picture a dockside full of jars stuck nose first in the beach like drunken flamingos. You can almost hear a satyr giggling as he tries to pull one back out, only to fall over himself. You climb aboard with Dionysus. The deck smells of pine tar, salt spray, and the faint tang of grapes from leaking amphorae. Sailors chant as they hoist the sails, their voices mingling with gull cries overhead. The god stands at the prow, hair tangled in the wind, and the villagers turned followers clutch their jars as if guarding treasure. Historians still argue whether Dionysian cult practices spread organically with trade or whether organized cults deliberately exported the god's worship. Was it wine that carried the god, or the god who carried wine? Either way, the sea is his new stage. The ship rocks gently, then more sharply as waves slap the hull. Some passengers groan, clutching their stomachs, not from hangovers this time, but seasickness. A satyr immediately declares this the ocean's hangover, and suggests feeding sufferers more wine to balance it out. Dionysus just laughs, tossing a cluster of grapes into the foam. The night stretches on as stars prick the sky. You recline on the deck, lulled by the creak of ropes and the rhythm of waves. Amphorae clink softly with each tilt, a lullaby of commerce and chaos. Around you, the cult is no longer just a handful of villagers, it's a growing caravan of believers, sailors, and wanderers who've tasted something they can't forget. Dionysus moves among them like a conductor, whispering to one, laughing with another, his presence as intoxicating as the drink itself. And you sense it, wine is no longer a secret of one grove. It's becoming a thread stitched through seas, binding islands and cities together, one sip at a time. The salt stings your lips, the deck sways beneath you, and you feel the strange truth settle in: you're no longer in a story about a god finding his drink. You're in a story about how a god carries his gift across the world, spilling it into every harbor, every household, every morning after headache that follows. The ship rocks gently under your feet, but the peace doesn't last. Shadows gather on the horizon, pirates. Their black sails cut across the water like sharp teeth, and soon their shouts fill the air. The crew stiffens, clutching oars and ropes, but Dionysus only smiles, as though danger itself were a chance for mischief. You stay close, because you know by now that wherever he goes, something extraordinary, and a little ridiculous, is about to unfold. Here's the mainstream fact: piracy was a constant threat in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. Ancient texts mention raiders capturing sailors or passengers, selling them into slavery, or seizing cargo. Many myths use pirates as stock villains, symbols of lawlessness and greed on the open water. Now for the quirky tidbit: one famous story tells of Tyrrhenian pirates who tried to kidnap Dionysus, mistaking him for a mortal prince they could ransom. Their big mistake: underestimating the god of chaos. Instead of resisting, Dionysus let himself be tied up, then filled the ship with wild illusions. Wine gushed from the planks, vines tangled the mast, and the pirates leapt overboard in terror, only to be turned into dolphins mid-dive. You can see it now, the pirates clamber aboard, sneering, blades flashing in the torchlight. They sneer at Dionysus, bound with a rope he could break in an instant. But as soon as they laugh, the deck trembles. Wine seeps between the boards, puddling at their feet. Ivy slithers up the mast like green fire. The air thickens with flute music, eerie and off-key, played by no visible hands. One pirate drops his sword, clutching his head, muttering that he feels drunk though he's touched no cup. Another gasps as grapes sprout from his shield. The satyrs are in hysterics, bleating laughter as pirates trip on their own feet. Historians still argue whether this myth was allegory, warning sailors that piety protected them at sea, or simply a bit of divine comedy added to Dionysus's legend. Was the dolphin transformation symbolic of mercy, or just another way to humiliate? No consensus exists, and Dionysus doesn't care. You clutch the railing as the pirates leap overboard, splashing into the sea. But instead of drowning, they twist mid-fall, their limbs shrinking, tails sprouting, voices turning into squeaks. Dolphins scatter in all directions, leaping out of the water with wild abandon. The ocean itself seems to laugh, silver arcs gleaming under the moonlight. The ship steadies. The crew breathes again. Dionysus shakes off his ropes and stretches, smiling at his followers as if to say, "See? Even enemies can be remade into playthings." You look over the side at the dolphins circling the ship, and you swear you hear them chuckling too, living reminders of a god's twisted sense of humor. The sea air tastes fresher now, tinged with salt and grape sweetness. You lean back against the mast, dizzy from the spectacle, and realize you're sailing with someone who never solves problems the simple way. To Dionysus, even pirates deserve a transformation, preferably one that leaves them squeaking forever in the waves. The sea fades behind you as the ship drifts into port, and soon you find yourself reclining in a chamber thick with the scent of wine and oil lamps. Cushions are piled high, lyres strum lazily, and philosophers argue in voices half slurred, half serious. You've entered the world of the first symposia, those long, rambling drinking parties where the line between wisdom and nonsense is as thin as a grape skin. Here's the mainstream fact: a symposium in ancient Greece wasn't just a drinking binge. It was a structured event where men reclined on couches, drank diluted wine, and talked about poetry, politics, or philosophy. Drinking games like kitabos, flinging dregs of wine at a target, were common, as were recitations of Homer or discussions of virtue. These gatherings were both social and intellectual, though the balance often tipped depending on how much wine was in the crater. Now for the quirky tidbit: some symposia hired flute girls or acrobats for entertainment, while others went all in on bizarre contests. One record describes a competition for who could drink while standing on one leg the longest. You can almost see a satyr wobbling on a hoof, wine sloshing everywhere, while mortals cheer as if it's high art. The room around you hums with conversation. A bearded philosopher declares that the soul is lighter than air, while his neighbor insists the soul is clearly heavier because it weighs you down when you're sad. Across the room, two young men argue whether olives taste better before or after soaking in brine. Everyone nods as if these are the great questions of the universe. Dionysus glides through it all, filling cups, loosening tongues, his presence both playful and commanding. He whispers in one ear, plants an outrageous thought in another, then sits back to watch mortals wrestle with ideas like clumsy wrestlers in sand. You realize that wine here is more than a drink, it's a door. It opens people up, makes them say things they'd never dare sober, and sometimes, those things stick. Historians still argue whether symposia were engines of democracy and philosophy or simply excuses for elite men to drink themselves silly while pretending to seek wisdom. Were they cradles of culture or just well-dressed frat parties? The truth, like the wine, was probably a mixture of both. The atmosphere is intoxicating in its own way. The lamplight flickers, casting shadows that look like dancing figures on the walls. The smell of resin from the wine jars mingles with burning incense. A man passes you a cup painted with images of satyrs chasing nymphs, and you notice the irony. art imitating the chaos happening in the very room. You recline, sipping slowly, listening as the talk drifts from lofty ideals to ridiculous anecdotes. Someone claims cabbage is the best cure for drunkenness, another insists it's figs, and a third declares boldly that nothing cures drunkenness but more drinking. The laughter that follows is loud, genuine, and just a little desperate. And through it all, Dionysus smiles knowingly. He has given mortals a tool, and now they're using it to blur the line between wisdom and folly. You feel your eyelids grow heavy, lulled by the hum of voices, the clink of cups, and the god's soft laughter weaving through it all like a hidden song. The symposium fades behind you like smoke, and soon you're outside under a wild night sky. Torches flicker in the distance, drums pulse against the hills, and the sound of shrill flutes carries through the trees. You follow Dionysus up a rocky slope, and there they are, the Maenads, his frenzied followers, dancing in spirals that make the ground itself seem unsteady. Their hair is loose, their eyes bright, their hands clutching Thyrsus staffs crowned with ivy. Here's the mainstream fact: in Greek religion, Maenads, literally, the raving ones, were women devoted to Dionysus, known for their ecstatic rituals in the mountains. They danced, shouted, and sometimes performed rites that blended religious devotion with raw release. These ceremonies became infamous, not just for their energy but for their potential to erupt into violence. Now the quirky tidbit: some ancient sources claim Maenads could nurse wild animals at their breasts or strike the ground with their staffs and cause springs of wine to flow. Imagine following one into the woods only to find her coaxing milk from a lion cub while casually sipping from a bubbling stream of vintage red. Even Dionysus must have chuckled at the exaggerations. You stand at the edge of their circle, the earth trembling with their stamping feet. Their cries are half song, half scream, a sound that feels like both prayer and party. Dionysus moves among them, and wherever he goes, the rhythm intensifies. You feel it in your bones, the pull to join, to let go of control, to blur the boundary between yourself and the writhing mass. Historians still argue whether the accounts of Maenads tearing animals apart were literal or symbolic. Were these descriptions just exaggerated metaphors for wild energy, or were they sensational tales told by nervous outsiders? No one knows for certain, and the mystery lingers like the echo of drums in your chest. The night smells of pine, wine-soaked breath, and sweat. Maenads whirl past you, their dresses flying, ivy wreaths slipping from their heads. One presses a fig into your hand before spinning away. Another cups your face briefly, her eyes shining with something between joy and madness. You can't tell whether you're at a religious rite or the wildest outdoor concert in history. Dionysus throws his arms wide, and the circle bursts outward, women running into the hills, singing so loudly the stars seem to lean closer. The satyrs crash after them, bleating and laughing, hooves pounding the dirt. The mountain itself feels alive, every rock humming with the rhythm of ecstatic abandon. You clutch the Thyrsus Dionysus suddenly presses into your hand. It feels warm, alive even, ivy coiling tighter as though it recognizes you. The moment is dizzying. You're no longer an observer but part of the dance, drawn into the current of frenzy that promises both liberation and exhaustion. And in that whirl of music, sweat, and starlight, you understand what the Maenads already know. Wine isn't just a drink, it's a doorway. Step through, and you leave behind rules, roles, and reason. What waits on the other side might be joy or ruin, but tonight, it's freedom, and Dionysus wouldn't have it any other way. The frenzy of the Maenads echoes through the hills long after they vanish into the dark. You're left with the lingering pulse of drums in your chest, but Dionysus's smile has already faded. The god of joy has shadows too, and you see them now as the night air sharpens. A colder presence stirs, Hera. Her jealousy is never far behind, and you realize this myth is also a chase. Wherever Dionysus spreads laughter and wine, Hera tries to tighten the noose. Here's the mainstream fact: in many myths, Hera relentlessly pursued Dionysus, sending madness or enemies to hound him. Sometimes she struck his followers with frenzy, other times she sought to destroy him outright. Her anger wasn't just personal, it reflected the unease of a patriarchal order facing a god whose worship often elevated women and outsiders. Now the quirky tidbit, some versions say Hera once convinced Dionysus to disguise himself as a girl to avoid detection. Imagine the god of wine sulking in a borrowed dress, stomping around the forest in sandals 2 sizes too small, muttering about stepmothers who just won't let things go. Even in danger, his myths carry humor like ivy tangled around thorns. You feel the tension sharpen. The air smells of ozone, a storm threatening. Villagers glance nervously at the sky, as if Hera herself might descend in lightning. One man mutters about crops failing if they anger the queen of gods. Another whispers that Dionysus should flee before she finds him here. The joy of the revels suddenly feels fragile, like a cup too thin to hold the weight of wine. Historians still argue whether Hera's opposition to Dionysus symbolized the resistance of established social order against more chaotic, ecstatic cults. Was she truly jealous of Zeus's illegitimate child, or was she the embodiment of those who feared what his worship represented? The debate remains, but in this moment, it feels real. Her anger presses against your skin like static. Dionysus, however, doesn't cower. He throws his head back and laughs, a sound that makes the vines tremble. He thrives on resistance, every pushback only makes him spread further, like spilled wine seeping into cracks. You watch him pick up a cup, fill it, and drink deeply, daring Hera to strike. The sky growls. You catch yourself holding your breath, half expecting lightning. But instead, only a breeze stirs, carrying the faint scent of rain. Dionysus wipes his mouth, smirks, and begins to hum. His followers relax slightly, though unease lingers in their eyes. They know the goddess isn't finished. She never is. You realize the story isn't just about grapes, wine, and revels, it's about tension, a tug-of-war between control and freedom. Hera embodies the order that wants to hold the world steady, Dionysus, the chaos that insists it must move, sway, and stumble forward. The vines shiver again in the night breeze, and you wonder which side will win, or whether the dance between them is the point all along. The air is cooler now, tinged with incense and the faint sound of chanting. Dionysus has led you away from the revels and storms into quieter ground, temples where healing is the focus, not frenzy. Stone steps rise before you, smooth from countless feet, leading to the shrine of Asclepius, god of medicine. The scent of burned herbs drifts from altars, and you realize Dionysus is curious to see how mortal healers approach the very problem he's been puzzling over, the aftermath of too much wine. Here's the mainstream fact: Asclepius was the Greek god of healing, worshipped at sanctuaries where the sick slept overnight, hoping for divine dreams that revealed cures. Priests prescribed remedies ranging from herbal treatments to diet adjustments, and wine sometimes played a role, both as a disinfectant and as a therapeutic drink. Even in medicine, Dionysus's gift couldn't be ignored. Now the quirky tidbit: inscriptions from some healing temples list bizarre cures, like sleeping beside a sacred snake or smearing yourself with mud from the sanctuary floor. You can't help picturing a poor soul staggering in with a hangover, only to be told, yes, the cure is definitely rolling in temple mud. Dionysus raises an eyebrow as a priest demonstrates this exact method, and the satyrs burst out laughing. The sanctuary glows with lamplight. Patients lie on mats, moaning softly, their bodies covered with wreaths of laurel or ivy. Some sip honey water, others chew bitter herbs. A priest intones prayers, his voice steady as the sound of dripping water. The atmosphere is calmer than the revels but carries its own strange energy, half hospital, half theater. Historians still argue whether these temple cures were more symbolic than practical. Was it the ritual itself, the dream incubation, the sacred setting, that healed people, or were the herbs and diets genuinely effective? Modern scholars see both, a blend of faith and pharmacology. And here, watching Dionysus peer into a bowl of steaming broth, you feel the blur firsthand. The god of wine walks among the patients, amused but not mocking. He crouches beside one man clutching his stomach and murmurs something that makes the man chuckle despite his pain. Another patient, pale and sweating, suddenly sits up after sipping spiced wine offered by a priest, swearing the gods have lifted the fog from his head. The satyrs, of course, turn the place into comedy. One pretends to faint dramatically on the temple floor, demanding a cure of figs and cheese. Another sneaks behind a priest, tying ivy leaves to his staff, declaring it improved. The patients giggle despite themselves, and even the priests hide smiles. You notice Dionysus watching closely. His face is calm, thoughtful, as if seeing that mortal medicine and divine revelry aren't enemies at all, they're branches of the same vine. Both seek to ease suffering, whether through laughter, ritual, or herbs. The sanctuary's torches flicker, shadows dancing across the columns. You lean back against the cool stone wall, breathing in the mingled scents of wine, herbs, and smoke. Somewhere in this space between medicine and myth, Dionysus smiles faintly, as though he's found another piece of the puzzle. The cure isn't one thing. It's many things, woven together, like vines twisting on a trellis. The temple fades into the distance, its lamplight swallowed by night. Dionysus leads you back to the shoreline, where ships bob gently against their moorings. The air smells of salt and tar, and beyond the horizon stretch trade routes carrying more than goods. They carry gods, stories, and remedies. You realize his influence isn't bound to Greece alone. Wine, and the cures for its aftermath, are drifting across borders like whispers in amphory. Here's the mainstream fact: Greek merchants and colonists spread viticulture to distant lands, from Egypt to Thrace to Italy. Along with wine went the rituals, songs, and medical lore tied to Dionysus. Other cultures adapted these ideas, blending them with their own traditions. The Phoenicians, for instance, were already skilled in wine trade, and their practices mingled with Greek ones to create something even larger. Now for the quirky tidbit: some records suggest that Egyptians drank beer as their staple but experimented with imported Greek wine, sometimes mixing it with herbs and dates. Imagine a weary Egyptian laborer trying the Greek cure for hangovers, chewing cabbage or mint, and muttering, "These island people are ridiculous." Dionysus, watching from the deck of a merchant ship, would probably agree. You climb aboard one of these vessels, its hull stacked with amphorae sealed with resin. The smell of pine pitch mixes with the faint perfume of spiced wine seeping from cracks. Sailors shout in Phoenician and Greek, their words blending like the cultures themselves. Satyrs sprawl across the cargo, sipping from stolen jars, while dolphins, you remember their pirate origins, leap alongside, squeaking like mischievous escorts. Historians still argue whether the cult of Dionysus spread because people genuinely loved the god or simply because they loved his drink. Was devotion the cause or the byproduct of intoxication? The debate persists like the aftertaste of sour wine, impossible to pin down. As the ship sails, you glimpse foreign ports, markets crowded with jars stamped with Greek emblems, healers trading recipes for remedies, priests arguing over whether wine is holy or dangerous. In some places, Dionysus becomes Bacchus, reshaped but recognizable, his cures reshuffled into local herbs and customs. Everywhere, though, the same pattern holds: joy first, pain after, and the eternal search for balance in between. The wind is heavy with salt, but underneath, you catch faint whiffs of rosemary, fennel, and strange spices packed for trade. Each port smells different, each culture layering new flavors into the drink. A satyr dips a paw into a jar of date wine, declares it too sweet, then downs it anyway. Dionysus only laughs, as if every experiment, even the odd ones, are part of his grand design. You lean against the rail, staring at the horizon as stars scatter above. The sea feels endless, the routes infinite, and it strikes you: the gods' hangover cures will never be just Greek anymore. They'll be Phoenician, Egyptian, Roman, whatever hands mix wine with herbs in the hope of easing tomorrow's headache. Dionysus has gone global, and with him, so has the eternal question: how do you enjoy the feast without regretting it in the morning? The ship glides into harbor, and suddenly the air hums with a different kind of tension. This isn't a backwater village or a mountain revel, this is a city-state, polished and proud, where even festivals have rules. You follow Dionysus through crowded streets strung with garlands, the smell of roasted lamb and fresh bread rising from stalls. Citizens in clean tunics bustle toward the agora, where officials debate an urgent matter: just how much wine is too much at a public celebration. Here's the mainstream fact: Greek festivals dedicated to Dionysus, like the city Dionysia in Athens, were highly organized events with magistrates overseeing the rituals, performances, and feasting. Even while honoring the god of chaos, cities tried to impose order, mandating how wine was to be mixed and served. Moderation was the official creed, though reality, as you've already seen, rarely obeyed. Now for the quirky tidbit: some festivals appointed a symposiarch, essentially a master of drinking, who decided how strong the wine would be. Picture a serious-looking man holding a ladle, solemnly watering down the crater, while satyrs heckle from the sidelines. You can almost hear one bleat, "More water." Boo, while Dionysus winks at the crowd. You squeeze into the assembly hall where men in cloaks argue over statutes. One insists dilution must be enforced to prevent madness in the streets. Another waves his arms, demanding that free-flowing wine honors the god better than watered-down gruel. Outside, citizens chant, "Let the cups be full." The whole city hums with the push and pull between order and indulgence. Historians still argue whether these regulations reflected genuine attempts at civic harmony or simply fear of disorder. Were city officials protecting the people, or protecting their own authority from Dionysus's wild influence? The evidence is mixed, much like the wine they guarded so closely. The smells of the festival drift in, incense curling from altars, honey cakes baking, smoke rising from sacrifices. Children weave ivy crowns while elders grumble about youth these days. Satyrs sneak into the square disguised as flute players, immediately blowing off-key to earn jeers and laughter. Even here, where rules are carved into stone, chaos wiggles through the cracks. Dionysus himself is radiant, striding into the debate like it's just another performance. He says nothing, only smiles, and somehow the room quiets. A magistrate drops his scroll mid-speech, and for a heartbeat the only sound is the faint trickle of wine being poured outside. Then, with a shrug, the god steps back into the crowd, leaving mortals to argue about what he truly wants. And that's the trick, isn't it? You realize the god thrives not in answers but in contradictions. Rules will be written, broken, rewritten, broken again. The debate will rage forever: should wine flow freely, or should it be tamed? In the middle stands Dionysus, laughing softly, cup in hand, knowing that the real answer is always both. The city festival rolls on, torches flickering against marble columns, but Dionysus slips away from the magistrate's quarrels into a quieter courtyard. You follow, and there, under the moonlight, poets and singers gather, their voices weaving stories thick as wine. Cups are raised, lyres strum, and words spill like rivers. Tonight, the hangover isn't just physical, it's philosophical, poetic, immortalized in verse. Here's the mainstream fact: Euripides, one of the great tragedians, wrote the Bacchae, a play centered on Dionysus, his revels, and the dangers of resisting him. Poets often praise the god of wine, portraying both the bliss and the terror of his gift. His myth was sung as hymns, recited in verses, and woven into the fabric of Greek literature. Now for the quirky tidbit: some drinking songs were hilariously blunt, with lines like, "Drink. Drink. For who knows if we'll see tomorrow." Catchy enough to become ancient earworms. Imagine waking with a pounding head and fragments of a song stuck in your mind, repeating endlessly as though mocking you. You can almost hear a satyr humming it off-key just to annoy you further. The courtyard is alive with voices. One poet declaims a hymn praising wine as the cure for sorrow, his words soaring into the night. Another counters with verses warning that too much leads to madness and ruin. They debate in rhyme, their lines sparking cheers and groans from the listeners sprawled on cushions. Dionysus sits among them, smiling, as though enjoying the spectacle of mortals trying to put into words what he embodies. Historians still argue whether these poetic praises of wine were sincere devotion or veiled social critique. Was a hymn to Dionysus meant as worship, or as satire about drunken neighbors. The ambiguity remains, much like the blurred line between tipsy wit and outright nonsense. The air smells of lamp oil and crushed herbs scattered across the floor. Bees buzz lazily around bowls of honey cakes. Lyres pluck soft notes that ripple like water, soothing even as cups refill again and again. You lean back, listening to the rhythm of verse, the pulse of laughter, the occasional off-key flute. One poet begins reciting lines that paint Dionysus not as a joybringer but as a healer of grief, a god who gives mortals the gift of forgetting sorrow for a while. Another interrupts with a bawdy ditty about losing sandals at a feast, which earns roaring applause. Dionysus claps along to both, never choosing, never preferring, because both are true. Wine heals, and wine embarrasses. Wine elevates, and wine trips you into the mud. You watch the words rise into the night, glowing like sparks from a fire, fleeting yet unforgettable. The god tilts his head, listening as though savoring each syllable, his smile softening into something almost wistful. Perhaps even he knows that stories, whether solemn tragedies or silly songs, are the real cure, the only way to make sense of the joy and the ache. And as you sip from your own cup, lulled by poetry and night air, you realize that this too is part of the cure. The words themselves, winding through the dark, soothe the pounding in your head better than any herb or onion ever could. The poet's voices drift away like smoke, and by dawn you find yourself in a city that is no longer entirely Greek. The streets feel broader, the arches taller, the bustle of the crowd heavier with Latin words. Dionysus has crossed into Roman territory, reshaped but unmistakable. Here, he is Bacchus, and his hangover cures are being translated along with his myths, poured into new cups but carrying the same sting. Here's the mainstream fact: when the Romans absorbed Greek culture, they took Dionysus with them, renaming him Bacchus. His festivals, the Bacchanalia, were infamous for their wild energy, so much so that the Roman Senate once tried to ban them in 186 BCE. Yet despite restrictions, Bacchus remained central to Roman religion, feasting, and daily life. Wine was no longer just Greek, it was Mediterranean. Now the quirky tidbit: Romans sometimes mixed their wine with resin, spices, or even seawater. Imagine attending a feast and being handed a goblet that tastes suspiciously like salted broth. One satyr nearby makes a face, muttering, "The fish had better parties before this." Dionysus, Bacchus now, merely shrugs and drinks anyway. You wander into a Roman banquet hall, the air thick with roasted meat, perfume, and incense. Reclining couches line the room, and mosaics gleam underfoot with patterns of vines and dolphins. Slaves pour wine into silver cups, and the guests sip, gossiping about politics one moment and belting out songs the next. Dionysus moves through the room, unseen yet felt, his laughter hidden behind every careless toast. Historians still argue whether the Roman adoption of Bacchus softened or intensified his worship. Did they tame the wild Greek god into polite convivium rituals, or did the cult survive underground, bursting out in secret gatherings of frenzy? The record is divided, and perhaps that division is exactly how Dionysus liked it. The smells are overwhelming: cinnamon sprinkled into cups, roasted boar dripping fat, garlands of roses wilting on sweating brows. Romans nibble little cakes of honey and nuts, swearing they help settle the stomach after indulgence. Others swear by garlic to stave off morning misery. You glance at a satyr gnawing raw garlic with gusto, only to clear an entire section of the hall with his breath. Dionysus watches the excess with fond amusement. He seems pleased that his influence hasn't diminished, it's only been translated, rephrased. Mortals still drink too much, still wake with pounding heads, still chase foolish remedies. And Bacchus, like Dionysus, collects their laughter and groans alike, weaving them into his endless myth. You recline on a Roman couch, sipping spiced wine, listening to the hum of conversation around you. It strikes you that the god's gift has become bigger than any single people, it's a tide washing over cultures, reshaping itself wherever it lands. Greece, Rome, wherever next, the cycle will follow: joy, pain, cure, and story. And somewhere in the din, Bacchus raises his cup, offering a silent toast. To headaches, to honey cakes, to salted wine and salty debates. To humanity, still searching for balance, still stumbling but laughing through it. The Roman banquet fades into silence, replaced by the hush of a countryside village. The air is cool, heavy with dew, and doorways creak open as townsfolk shuffle into the square. They aren't nobles or poets, just ordinary people clutching their temples and muttering prayers. Dionysus drifts among them like a breeze, listening, amused, as they reveal the stranger remedies of folk belief. Here's the mainstream fact: across the ancient world, common people relied on amulets, charms, and household rituals as much as herbs or diets. Medicine was expensive, priests weren't always nearby, and so superstition filled the gap. Necklaces of protective stones, whispered incantations, even odd objects worn on the body were thought to deflect illness, or in this case, hangovers. Now the quirky tidbit: some villagers hung laurel or amethyst stones around their necks, believing they warded off drunkenness. Others recited specific phrases before bed, hoping to trick the headache demon into passing them by. You watch one woman tie a fish bone to her husband's wrist, declaring it a safeguard. He promptly snores so loudly that you suspect the only thing the bone protects is her patience. The square smells of hearth smoke, garlic, and damp earth. People gather around Dionysus, though most don't recognize him as a god, just a stranger with an amused smile. They thrust charms into his hands, knotted cords, carved figurines, wreaths of herbs. One old man insists that hanging an eel skin above the bed prevents headaches. A satyr doubles over laughing, bleating, that's just an excuse to keep eels indoors. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were born from genuine attempts at healing or were symbolic gestures, ways of showing faith when nothing else worked. Did amulets really matter, or was the act of wearing them enough to convince the sufferer they'd feel better? The line between placebo and piety blurs again, shimmering like morning mist. Dionysus accepts each charm graciously, as though every idea, no matter how absurd, has a place in his story. He ties a knotted cord around his own wrist, winks at the villagers, and immediately downs a cup of leftover wine. The crowd gasps, then cheers, convinced their talisman has passed the test. He only laughs softly, his eyes glimmering with mischief. You wander the edges of the square, watching children chase each other with ivy wreaths, goats sniffing at the piles of herbs dropped carelessly on the ground. The whole scene is equal parts sincere and silly, sacred and slapstick. You can't help smiling, even as your own head still feels heavy from last night's wine. Maybe belief itself is the cure, no matter how strange the form it takes. The villagers disperse slowly, muttering their charms, hanging amulets above doors, whispering prayers under their breath. Dionysus lingers, amused, as though pleased to see that even in obscurity, his influence spawns creativity. Whether it's eels, amethyst, or ivy wreaths, mortals refuse to accept misery without a fight. And as the morning sun breaks fully across the rooftops, you realize the god doesn't distinguish between science and superstition, cure and comedy. To him, it's all part of the same play, the endless, inventive ways mortals try to dance with joy without tripping on its shadow. By midday, the square is empty, the charms dangling from doors like sleepy guardians. But Dionysus is already tugging you toward the scent of roasted meat and the rising clamor of voices. A great hall opens before you, filled with couches and smoke, where banquets stretch late into the night. Here, wine doesn't flow in measured cups, it gushes like rivers. This is where overindulgence rules, and excuses for the morning after are crafted with as much care as the feasts themselves. Here's the mainstream fact: Greek and Roman banquets, symposia and convivia, were renowned for excess, often lasting until dawn. Writers described couches crowded with guests, food piled high, and wine mixed and remixed until nobody remembered the ratio anymore. These gatherings weren't just meals, they were social theaters, proving wealth, wit, and stamina all at once. Now the quirky tidbit: one Roman text describes guests inventing excuses for drinking too much before they even began, claims like, "I drink only to honor the gods," or, "This cup is for the health of my ancestors." Imagine a guest raising his sixth goblet, solemnly declaring, "It would be impious not to." A satyr in the corner applauds the creativity, hiccuping through his laughter. The banquet hall buzzes with noise. Musicians pluck lyres, servants bustle with trays of figs and lamb, and guests boast in loud, slurred voices. The smell is overwhelming, roasted boar dripping fat, honey cake sticky on fingers, wine sharp and resinous in the air. Dionysus reclines at the head of it all, eyes gleaming, his presence both blessing and dare. Historians still argue whether these feasts were genuine religious acts in honor of Dionysus or merely social displays dressed up in sacred trappings. Were the excuses sincere piety, or just clever ways to justify indulgence? The record leaves room for both, and perhaps that tension was the point. You watch as a guest fumbles with a cup, spilling wine down his tunic. He immediately declares, "It was for the earth gods," and everyone cheers, lifting their cups in solidarity. Another insists that drinking heavily ensures prophetic dreams, then promptly falls asleep face first in a bowl of lentils. The room roars with laughter, and Dionysus smirks as if he's seen it all before. The satyrs are at their most chaotic here, weaving between couches, stealing figs, pouring wine into empty sandals as practical jokes. One plays a flute terribly, convinced the squealing sound will drive headaches away. Another insists that sleeping under the table guarantees no hangover. Judging by the snoring pile of limbs already beneath the feast, this method has plenty of supporters. You recline with the rest, cup in hand, head buzzing. Somewhere between the laughter and the haze, you realize the truth: these banquets are where humans and gods meet, not in temples, but in shared foolishness. Excess becomes ritual, excuses become myths, and tomorrow's misery is simply the cost of tonight's joy. Dionysus raises his goblet high, wine dripping down his arm, and the room erupts in cheers. In that moment, you understand, hangovers may be dreadful, but they're also proof that you've lived, feasted, and laughed under the gods' watchful eye. The banquet blurs into a haze of laughter and crumbs, but eventually the hall grows quiet. Candles sputter out, leaving only the glow of embers. You drift into the cool night air, stomach heavy, head already preparing tomorrow's complaint. Dionysus, however, leads you to a shaded courtyard where another kind of gathering waits. Here, the noise is softer, the air scented with olive oil lamps, and the voices belong not to revelers but to philosophers, stern men with furrowed brows and cups still in hand. Here's the mainstream fact: Greek philosophers often discussed moderation in drinking. Plato, in the Laws, warned of drunkenness disrupting civic order, while Aristotle mused on balance and the golden mean. Even while acknowledging wine's pleasures, many insisted that virtue meant keeping one's wits about you. These were the voices of reason trying to leash the god of excess. Now the quirky tidbit: some accounts describe philosophers testing their own tolerance as if it were a moral experiment. One anecdote tells of a thinker bragging he could drink unmixed wine without stumbling, a claim disproven when he promptly fell into a fountain. You half expect one of the men before you to repeat the performance. The courtyard hums with debate. One philosopher declares that wine is the mirror of the soul: too much, and it reveals ugliness; just enough, and it uncovers hidden truth. Another argues that abstinence is the only safe course, wagging his finger until a satyr plops a wreath of ivy on his head, instantly derailing his seriousness. Historians still argue whether these warnings against excess reflect genuine fear of Dionysian cults or were more about maintaining social order. Were philosophers truly concerned about the health effects, or were they nervous about the social upheaval wine-fueled rituals encouraged? The question lingers like the aftertaste of sour grapes. The night air is cool, carrying scents of laurel and smoke. Owls call from the trees, punctuating the philosopher's sentences with eerie timing. The men sip carefully from watered wine, speaking of virtue and balance, while Dionysus listens from the shadows, amused. His smile says, "Yes, yes, preach moderation, while your cup is never empty." You sit among them, head still buzzing, and hear one man suggest that wine is like fire, useful in moderation, dangerous in excess. Another counters that without fire, humanity would still sit in darkness. Their voices rise, not in frenzy but in conviction, and you realize they're not wrong. Joy and ruin are twined together, always have been, always will be. A satyr interrupts the solemn mood by attempting to quote Plato, but he gets the words hopelessly wrong, substituting goats for souls. The courtyard erupts in laughter, even from the sternest philosopher. Dionysus chuckles softly, and you know he's pleased, even in the company of reason. Folly sneaks in like ivy through cracks in stone. The debate drifts on, more thoughtful than the banquets but no less bound to the god. Moderation, virtue, folly, they all circle Dionysus like moths around a flame. And as you lean back, head heavy but heart light, you see clearly, wisdom and wine will always be uneasy companions, yet inseparable all the same. The philosopher's words fade behind you, their cautionary tones dissolving into the night air. Dionysus is already moving again, restless as always, leading you beyond familiar hills and seas. The air thickens with spice, strange flowers bloom at the path's edge, and soon you realize you've crossed into lands the Greeks called the East. Here, the god stretches his myth wider, adopting new flavors, new remedies, and new stories to suit foreign soil. Here's the mainstream fact: Greek accounts describe Dionysus traveling eastward, particularly into India, where he supposedly spread viticulture. While largely mythical, these tales symbolize the spread of wine culture along trade routes. In reality, new fruits and herbs from Asia mingled with Mediterranean practices, expanding both cuisine and medicine. Now the quirky tidbit: some sources claim Dionysus encountered exotic fruits like dates and pomegranates and immediately tried fermenting them. You imagine him holding up a sticky jar of pomegranate brew, squinting, and declaring, "It's wine-ish." Satyrs slurp it noisily, staining their faces crimson until they look like they've been in a brawl. The air here smells different, cinnamon and cardamom carried on the breeze, mingling with the sharp tang of fermenting fruit. Local healers meet Dionysus with curiosity, offering their own remedies, ginger infusions for nausea, spiced teas to steady the head. Mortals here have their own strategies for balancing indulgence, and Dionysus listens, intrigued, weaving their knowledge into his growing tapestry of cures. Historians still argue whether these eastern journeys were meant as symbolic conquests or as mythic explanations for cultural exchange. Was Dionysus's trip to India a tale of colonization, or a poetic way to account for the blending of foreign practices into Greek life? No one agrees, but in this moment, the debate feels less important than the smell of bubbling brews in clay jars at your feet. You kneel beside one such jar, thick with fermenting dates. The taste is rich, syrupy, a far cry from the tart bite of Greek grapes. A satyr spits his sample into the dirt, wailing that it's too sweet, while another guzzles 3 cups and promptly falls asleep against a palm tree. Dionysus, of course, savors it, eyes half closed, as though testing how joy tastes in a new tongue. The people here laugh at Greek cabbage remedies, offering ginger roots instead, their sharp scent cutting through the humid air. A woman presses a sprig of mint into your hand, showing how it's steeped into a calming drink. You sip, and for a moment the heaviness in your head lifts, carried away by the spice. The god nods approvingly, as though confirming that the cure doesn't belong to one land but to many. The night glows with lanterns, their light reflecting on bronze jars and jeweled cups. Drums thrum in patterns different from Greek rhythms, but the energy is the same: laughter, music, and the inevitable groans of tomorrow's hangovers. Dionysus is at home here too, as though borders mean nothing to a god whose true domain is the space between pleasure and pain. You glance eastward, beyond the hills, and wonder, how many fruits, how many herbs, how many strange cures will join his myth before the journey ends? The answer, you realize, is as endless as the vines that curl and spread wherever mortals gather with cups in hand. The spice-scented night gives way to daylight, and with it comes laughter that echoes louder than drums. You follow Dionysus back toward the heart of the city, where a crowd is gathering in a small theater. Wooden benches creak under the weight of eager spectators, and the air is thick with anticipation. This isn't a ritual or a feast, it's a comedy, a satirical play performed in honor of the god himself. And the main subject? Drunks and their pitiful attempts at recovery. Here's the mainstream fact: ancient Greek theater, particularly old comedy, often poked fun at daily life, including wine, drinking, and hangovers. Playwrights like Aristophanes filled the stage with characters who slurred, stumbled, and schemed, offering both laughter and gentle warning. Theater was entertainment, but it was also a civic ritual, performed at festivals dedicated to Dionysus. Now for the quirky tidbit: in some plays, actors wore exaggerated masks with comically large mouths or bulbous noses, designed to make drunken foolishness larger than life. You watch as one actor staggers across the stage in a mask painted crimson, groaning dramatically about his pounding head. Another wobbles with a giant amphora strapped to his back, shouting, "This is my cure," before toppling over. The audience howls. The smells of the theater drift in, dust rising from the stage, smoke from torches, the faint sweetness of wine carried in from nearby stalls. Children giggle at the pratfalls while elders shake their heads knowingly, muttering about how accurate it all feels. Even satyrs squeeze onto the benches, hooting and clapping like the best hecklers in history. Historians still argue whether these comic portrayals of drunkenness were meant as moral lessons or simply as crowd pleasers. Were they warnings against excess, or just a chance to laugh at neighbors who couldn't hold their cups? Either way, the effect is the same: shared recognition of the joy and absurdity in being human. You watch as a troupe performs a mock hangover clinic. One actor dressed as a healer prescribes absurd remedies, wrapping your head in cabbage leaves, dancing in a circle, or shouting insults at the sun until it forgives you. Each patient obeys with ridiculous exaggeration, collapsing into spasms of complaint. The crowd roars, tears streaming from their eyes, while Dionysus sits among them, grinning with unmistakable pride. The performance blurs the line between worship and ridicule. To laugh at drunkenness is, in a way, to honor the god who invented it. Dionysus doesn't need solemn hymns alone, he thrives on giggles, belly laughs, and the foolish honesty that wine reveals. You realize that theater itself is another cure, a way of transforming the pain of the morning after into communal joy. As the play ends, actors bow, masks grinning grotesquely in the torchlight. The audience erupts in cheers, some shouting for more, others swearing to never drink again, at least until tomorrow. Dionysus throws his head back and laughs, the sound carrying across the stage like a final line in a comedy. You walk out with the crowd, heart lighter, head still faintly aching but soothed by laughter. The cure, it seems, isn't only in herbs or food, but in stories, jokes, and the simple relief of knowing that everyone, from kings to shepherds, has woken up at least once saying, "Never again." The theater's laughter fades into memory as you drift into another city, this one buzzing with unease. Soldiers march in the streets, magistrates whisper behind scrolls, and rumors coil like smoke. The back-chic rites have grown too wild, too dangerous. You sense what's coming before it's spoken: imperial edicts, laws meant to curb Dionysus's reach, to bottle up chaos with ink and decree. Here's the mainstream fact: in 186 BCE, the Roman Senate issued the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a decree that restricted back-chic worship. Authorities feared the secret, nocturnal gatherings and the possibility of political conspiracy under the cover of drunken ritual. The cult was never fully destroyed, but its practice was forced underground, reshaped into smaller, regulated forms. Now for the quirky tidbit: the edict was inscribed on bronze tablets and nailed in public places, essentially the ancient version of posting a warning flyer. You can picture townsfolk squinting at the stern words while satyrs sneak behind them to scrawl doodles of grapes and goats. Somewhere, a bored scribe probably muttered, "Good luck banning wine in Italy." The city smells sharp with anxiety, parchment, ink, and the faint tang of fear mixed with wine still flowing in taverns despite the ban. Officials stand tall in their togas, declaring with solemn voices that back-chic rites must be limited, participants licensed, gatherings supervised. Yet even as they speak, you catch the wink of a lantern in an alley, a secret invitation to midnight revels no law can touch. Historians still argue whether the Senate's decree was motivated by genuine fear of unrest or by politics, the need to assert control over a popular, foreign cult. Was it morality, or power? The truth, as with most things Dionysian, is probably tangled like vines in a trellis. You slip into one of those hidden gatherings, lanterns flickering low in a cellar. The air is heavy with incense, whispers, and the clink of cups. Men and women alike wear ivy crowns, their eyes bright with defiance. A satyr plays a tune too soft for the street to hear, while Dionysus himself lounges in the corner, amused at the futility of rules. The wine tastes sharper here, stolen from censored feasts, mixed with secrecy. Every sip feels like rebellion, every laugh a challenge to authority. You watch as ivy leaves are pressed into hands like passwords, and oaths are whispered over clay cups, "We'll keep the god alive, no matter what Rome says." The air grows thick with heat, with defiance, with the thrill of breaking decrees. Dionysus raises his cup, toasting not just joy but resistance, and you feel it resonate in your bones. The god of wine has always thrived on contradiction, honored in temples by day, worshipped in cellars by night. No law can chain him, no edict can silence the laughter of the inebriated. As dawn breaks, the city above stirs, oblivious. The tablets still hang, bronze and stern, proclaiming order. But down here in the shadows, ivy curls stronger, wine flows deeper, and Dionysus smiles. His cult survives not by obeying, but by slipping through cracks, like spilled wine staining stone forever. Morning comes again, centuries later, and the world feels different. The marble columns have crumbled, the Senate has fallen, and yet the name of Dionysus still lingers, though now it's whispered by monks in cloisters, carried in recipes written in careful Latin script. You follow the god into a stone monastery tucked into a green valley, where the air smells of bread, ink, and fermenting grapes. His legacy hasn't vanished, it's just wearing a new robe. Here's the mainstream fact: during the Middle Ages, Christian monks preserved viticulture across Europe. Monasteries cultivated vineyards, brewed wine for mass, and experimented with remedies for overindulgence. While the worship of Dionysus was long gone, the practical art of tending vines and soothing the body lived on in cloister walls. Now the quirky tidbit: some monastic records list hangover remedies that sound suspiciously like recycled Dionysian lore. Remedies included soaking bread in wine, sipping vinegar water, or applying poultices of herbs to the temples. In other words, even monks couldn't pray the headache away, they still needed cabbage soup and honey water. Imagine a solemn friar muttering psalms with one hand and clutching his pounding head with the other. The monastery hums with quiet industry. Monks in brown habits shuffle between vineyards and scriptoriums, their sandals scuffing on stone. The smell of yeast and must wafts from the cellar, where rows of barrels wait. Dionysus wanders unseen among them, smiling faintly, his fingers brushing ivy that dares to grow even in the shadow of the cross. Historians still argue whether these monastic practices truly severed wine from its pagan past or whether they unconsciously carried fragments of the god forward. Was Bacchus erased, or merely disguised under the sign of the chalice? The debate lingers, and you can feel both answers humming in the still air. A monk passes you a clay mug of spiced broth, insisting it steadies the stomach after too much drink. Another recommends a prayer to Saint Bibiana, patron saint of hangovers. Satyrs, of course, are lurking just outside the cloister walls, bleating laughter and suggesting that monks should test their cures more thoroughly. One even sneaks inside, steals a loaf of bread, and is chased out with a broom. The air smells of parchment and herbs, rosemary, sage, fennel. Recipes are copied carefully, binding remedies into books that will survive centuries. You glance at one page, its neat script declaring, honey water for the head's heaviness after wine. You almost laugh, it's the same trick Dionysus tested with villagers so long ago. And here's the strangest realization: the god doesn't seem angry about being half forgotten. He lingers at the edge of the cloister with a knowing smile, as if satisfied that his legacy lives on, hidden in barrels and recipes, disguised as medicine and ritual. Mortals still drink, still wake aching, still reach for remedies, whether they call on Dionysus, Bacchus, or Saint Bibiana doesn't seem to matter. You breathe in the cool monastery air and realize, the god has survived by weaving himself into habit, prayer, and the very soil of vineyards. His laughter echoes faintly in the cloister bells, reminding you that wine and its morning after shadow never truly left. The monastery fades behind you, its bells tolling softly in the distance, and you find yourself walking once more through vineyards at dusk. The air is golden, the vines heavy, and the god of wine strolls beside you, quieter now. His long journey, from Thunderthigh birth to village revels, from Roman bands to monastic cellars, has shown you not just how wine spread, but how its shadow, the hangover, demanded cures, rituals, and stories at every step. Tonight, as the sun sinks, the myth itself ripens into something timeless. Here's the mainstream fact: Dionysus remained one of the most enduring figures of classical mythology, his influence woven into theater, religion, and medicine alike. Even when Christianity overtook pagan cults, echoes of his rites survived in festivals, feasts, and vineyard traditions that shaped European culture. Now the quirky tidbit: some medieval remedies claimed you could cure a hangover by wearing your clothes inside out or by kissing the nose of a black donkey. You can almost hear satyrs cackling, daring mortals to try it, while Dionysus shrugs, sipping from his eternal cup, amused by human persistence. The evening deepens. The vineyard smells of earth and ripening fruit, cicadas hum their steady chorus, and the air feels thick with history. You walk between rows of vines, every leaf whispering fragments of stories, onions chewed in desperation, ivy crowns wilted on foreheads, philosophers muttering about moderation, poets praising both joy and regret. Each cure, each song, each law, each rebellion adds another thread to the tapestry. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was a liberator or a corrupter, whether his rites healed societies or threatened them. Was he the god who lifted grief or the god who sowed madness? You glance at him now, walking barefoot through the vineyard, and you realize the answer is both. Always both. He pauses at the last row of grapes, plucks one, and presses it into your hand. The skin glistens in the twilight, fragile, ready to burst. One grape, joy and suffering, laughter and headaches, theater and philosophy, rebellion and ritual. Everything distilled into a sphere no bigger than your fingertip. You eat it, the juice sweet and tart at once, and your throat warms with the taste of the whole myth. The sun dips below the hills, painting the vineyard in soft indigo. Dionysus smiles faintly, his hair tangled with ivy, his eyes glimmering like wine in lamplight. He says nothing, you don't need words. His story isn't a sermon, it's a rhythm: feast, regret, cure, repeat. The oldest cycle humanity knows, still spinning under every sky. The vines curl tighter as darkness settles, and the god's laughter fades into the night breeze. You're left among the rows, the silence deep, the air thick with memory. Tomorrow will bring headaches and remedies, laughter and rules, stories and songs. But tonight, in this vineyard of myth, you are simply part of the eternal vintage. The vineyard quiets now, each leaf stilled, each grape heavy with unspoken promise. You walk slowly, your steps soft against the soil, and the world seems to breathe slower with you. The frenzy of festivals, the laughter of satyrs, the warnings of philosophers, all of it drifts away like echoes in the hills. What remains is only the hush, the stillness, the gentle hum of night folding itself around you. Your breath matches the rhythm of the cicadas, steady, unhurried. The air smells faintly of ivy and cool earth, soothing in its simplicity. You let your shoulders drop, your body grow heavier, as though the vines themselves are cradling you. Every cure you've seen, herbs steeped in bowls, bread dipped in honey, whispered charms against pain, feels far away now. You don't need them. The only cure left is rest, and the gentle reassurance that tomorrow will arrive, soft and forgiving. Dionysus lingers only in memory, his laughter quieter now, like a lullaby carried on the wind. The stars spread above you, pale and countless, and you feel yourself drifting, their glow blurring into one long stretch of calm. Each breath carries you deeper, away from the clamor of feasts, away from the sting of headaches, into a place where the world feels weightless. The vineyard fades, replaced by nothing but stillness, a quiet space where you are safe, where you are already healing. Let your eyes close fully now. Let the story dissolve into silence. The night is yours. The dream is waiting. And Dionysus, with all his wild joy, has finally led you to peace.